Now that we've talked about the ManagedBlocker interface, let's take a look at how it can be applied in practice to solve actual problems with blocking code. And we're going to take a look at a couple of different examples that illustrate this for blocking synchronizers and blocking queues. Be aware it also works for things like blocking I/O as well. This particular example that we're going to look at comes straight out of the Java docs documentation for ManagedBlocker. And the only real difference between looking at the documentation and what I'm about to describe to you is that the documentation doesn't walk through everything step by step, which of course is what we're going to do. So you can see here, we define a class called ManagedBlocker that implements the ManagedBlocker interface. And what it's going to be used for here is to handle a blocking synchronizer. As you can see, there's a field here that's a reentrant lock. And we go ahead and pass in a reentrant lock to the constructor. We stash that away in the field. So that's now been stored so we can get access to it from other methods in the ManagedBlocker class. Then we have a isReleasable method. And what it tries to do is it keeps track of whether or not we've got the lock. And if we don't have the lock, it attempts to do a non-blocking acquire by calling try lock. If we get lucky and the lock is available, then we acquire the lock without blocking, and we set has lock to true. If we don't get lucky, then we're going to have to be prepared to block. And here's what the block method does. It checks once again to see if we've already acquired the lock, and if we have not, then it goes ahead and locks the lock. And that will block until the lock is available, in which case that call can return, and it'll return true because it's no longer blocking. So that's a very simple example demonstrating the use of the ManagedBlocker interface for synchronized I/O. Let's now shift our attention to a different example. This one's going to handle a non-blocking queue. So we call this QTaker. QTaker also implements ManagedBlocker, as you can see here. And it has a blocking queue field that it defines. And that blocking queue is set in the constructor of QTaker. So the blocking queue, which could be a linked blocking queue or an array blocking queue or whatever, doesn't matter. It's a blocking queue. And so that'll be stashed away in the MQ field. The next thing we're going to do is implement the isReleasable method. And this is going to first check to see whether we've already acquired an item. And if we haven't, we're going to call poll on our blocking queue. And hopefully you recall from our earlier discussions that poll will try to get an item. And if there is an item in the queue, it'll take it. But if there's not an item in the queue, it will not block. It'll just return null. So we'll return true if we either have already got an item from an earlier call or we get it when we call poll. But if we don't get the item, we're going to return false. So that means we didn't block, we didn't get it. Now we have to call block. You can see what block does down here. It goes ahead and just checks once again to see if the item is null. And if the item is null, it goes ahead and calls the take method on the blocking queue. And of course, take will block, and that'll block until an item is available, in which case we get the item and then we return true. So that's how the QTaker implementation works. There's one more helper method here called getItem. And this particular method could be called by some other part of the program to return the item after we had gotten ManagedBlock to return. So once ManagedBlock comes back, then in that case, this thing is going to return. And keep in mind that these QTaker and the other stuff will be used in conjunction with calls to the ManagedBlock method on the common fork join pool. So that's the end of the overview of how you can use the Java fork join pool's ManagedBlocker interface. But one thing you'll notice here is there's still a little bit of extra work to do because you have to inherit stuff and define things and fill in these methods and so on and so forth. So it's perhaps a little bit more convoluted than we might like in practice. So the next part of the lesson, we'll look at another way to do this by defining a wrapper class to encapsulate the ManagedBlocker interface in a more clean style.